So thank you so much for having me to your monthly meeting, and thanks to Ed for the invitation. This is an adventure for me. As Craig knows, I don't only teach in the North, I live in the North, meaning north of Steeles. And so this is a great adventure to be all the way downtown. So what I'm going to be focusing on today is the migrant workers who came from the Caribbean and who were initially part of the West Indies domestic scheme, domestic workers scheme that many of you probably know about, and a little bit past the scheme into the temporary visitors workers programs that many of these women continue to work within. The launch of the West Indian domestic scheme, which I will just refer to as the scheme, in 1955, eventually brought thousands of Caribbean women to work as domestic servants in Canadian households. But it did not occur in a historical vacuum. From the establishment of the settler colonies in places that would coalesce into the Canadian nation state, there were non-familial workers, including enslaved persons of African descent, some of whom had Caribbean links, who were tasked with domestic labor. Whether in New France, Halifax, or Upper Canada, Black workers toiled in the households of their enslavers and later their employers, replicating an association between Black bodies, labor, and servitude that became fixed in the Canadian imaginary by the 20th century. That Black women, in particular, became discursively and materially tied to the domestic and emotional labor, as well as the expectations of service and servitude, were their realities, whether they were among the Black communities established across the country, especially in the Maritimes and southwestern Ontario, or they were newer migrants in Vancouver, Edmonton, Montreal, or Toronto. The enlistment of Caribbean women, most of whom were Black, to perform domestic work spoke to long extant patterns of racialized labor recruitment while maintaining the much vaunted myth of a tolerant, progressive Great White North, which was racially and geographically pristine. Where migrant Caribbean domestic workers were concerned, while there is an understandable focus on the scheme, it is important to note that from at least the 1920s, Canadians have been recruiting Caribbean women to work in their households. In March of 1920, for instance, the Royal Employment Bureau in Kingston, Jamaica, advertised for a general house worker for a, quote, wealthy Canadian lady in Ontario who promised, quote, good wages and prospects, passage advanced, as long as the successful applicant was respectable. In June of 1920, the same bureau sought 9 general helps to work for several well-to-do Canadians, quote. Successful applicants were promised, quote, good wages and prospects, and passage was also advanced. The recruits were required to be, quote, honest, respectable, industrious, healthy, and to have some experience in general housework, and importantly, they were to be girls or unencumbered young widows. Given these foundations, the attitude towards and treatment of women recruited to serve through the scheme and beyond ought not to have been surprising. In 1946, and then again in 1954, the Executive Council of the Jamaican government sent delegations to the Canadian government, quote, to explore the possibilities of recruiting Jamaicans for agricultural and domestic work in Canada. However, the Canadians responded that, quote, there was no need to draw on Jamaican sources of labor, and that the Canadian climate was not likely to prove favorable to such a scheme, end quote. Furthermore, the Canadian government's representatives said they were, quote, already engaged in sponsoring numerous immigrants, particularly from Europe, on a permanent basis, end quote, and had no need for Caribbean workers. However, as Audrey Macklin has argued, responding to pressure from Canadian employers and the British Caribbean governments, the Canadian authorities reversed themselves and established agreements between Canada and Jamaica, Canada and Barbados, and later other Caribbean governments. This scheme was to recruit the region's women to perform domestic service, primarily childcare and general house care, and in 1955, the scheme was launched. Given the state of chronic unemployment and underemployment, poor infrastructure, limited educational and employment opportunities, which characterize the Caribbean after centuries of horrendous economic exploitation by British imperialists and their American counterparts, that women would volunteer for what was deemed, quote, a wonderful opportunity, end quote, was understandable. Successful applicants were encouraged to embrace, quote, the responsibility to make good so that in the future years, other West Indian women can look forward to similar opportunities, end quote. After all, they were told, remember, if you fail, you will let down not only yourself, but your country. If you make good, you will be a credit to your country and contribute towards the continuation of the scheme. In addition to the conjoined burden on the selected women to perform as skilled domestic workers and as representatives of West Indian womanhood, the promises made by the scheme, its vague parameters and internal contradictions would make the lives of the many Caribbean women who labored within the Canadian households extremely difficult. Among the many significant concerns among the recruited workers was a clear requirement, as stated by the Jamaican Ministry of Labor, that, quote, selection was to be confined to single women without children within the age group 21 to 35 years. Applicants must furnish their birth certificates, end quote. The selectees, quote, should not expect, after arrival in Canada, to send for dependents. In any case, arrangements should be made to the satisfaction of the ministry for the care and support of dependents, end quote. So on the one hand, they were told not to have dependents, but on the other, that if they had them, they should be looked after. Unless these dependents were other than partners and children, the internal contradictions were already apparent. These contradictions came to a head in 1975, when the Canadian government decided to deport more than 50 Caribbean women who had been recruited to work as domestic servants. According to Michele Silvero, quote, the charge was that they had submitted fake immigration applications claiming they had no children, but were now attempting to apply for landed status for children they now acknowledged in Jamaica, end quote. After unsuccessful appeals to the Canadian Immigration Appeal Board and the Federal Court of Appeal, in March 1978, 7 of the women filed a complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, arguing that the deportation order was a result of discrimination on the basis of race, national or ethnic origin, color, and sex. According to Erica Lawson, the women did not deny their false statements about their children, but said they had been encouraged not to declare their children by the Jamaican Ministry of Labor, since the children were not traveling with them. Further, they said Canadian manpower and immigration representatives who were involved in the selection process knew about the advice they had been given re their children, but ignored it in their anxiety to answer the demand for domestic workers. The case of the 7 Jamaican mothers resulted in joint actions from a range of individuals and groups, including the International Coalition to End Domestic Exploitation, Intercede, the International Committee Against Racism, Canadians Against the Deportation of Immigrant Women, the Universal African Improvement Association, the Canadian Labour Party, teachers, trade unionists, and faith leaders, who together initiated a campaign to save the 7. The 7 women were eventually forced to leave Canada in January of 1979, but they were informed by the immigration minister that they would receive a sympathetic hearing if they tried to migrate again. 6 months later, the 7 were allowed to re-enter Canada on permits from the Ministry of Employment and Immigration. In their struggles to remain in Canada, the women and their representatives made repeated references to their roles as providers for their children, indicating not only a challenge to the Eurocentric gender ideology, which vaunted the primacy of the male breadwinner, but making clear their crucial contributions to what were, in fact, transnational families. As Lawson argues, the case was about, quote, much more than the issuance of deportation orders based on the accusation of false claims. At its core, the case was about identity, power, gender, belonging, and the contested value of racialized labor in Canada, end quote. In many ways, the case was connected to the scheme. The social construction, the earlier social construction of Black Caribbean women through the West Indies domestic scheme denied embodied identities. According to Lawson, it regulated Black women and managed the tension between the need for expendable labor and the desire to nurture the roots of a white settler colony society. The women's case symbolized the plight of immigrants struggling to establish themselves in Canada under difficult circumstances, highlighting in particular the restrictions imposed on other temporary workers. Just in case you think the success of the 7 Jamaican women meant an end to the attempt to deport women, please think again. Mavis Baker, mother of 4, arrived in Canada on a visitor's visa in August of 1981. She found employment as a domestic worker and stayed in the country for 11 years, during which time she had 4 children. After the birth of her 4th child in Canada, Baker experienced depression and slowly descended into chronic mental illness. When she was ordered deported from the country based on Canadian immigration law, she submitted an appeal. And I have here the quote from the immigration officer who responded to her appeal. Quote, and I'm going to emphasize the places where he wrote in bold. This case is a catastrophe. It's an indictment on our system. The client came as a visitor in August of 1981 and was not ordered deported until December 1992, and in April of 1994 is still here. The person is a paranoid schizophrenic and on welfare. She has no qualifications other than as a domestic. She has 4 children in Jamaica and another 4 born here. She will, of course, be a tremendous strain on our social welfare systems for probably the rest of her life. There are no humanitarian compassionate factors other than her 4 Canadian-born children. Do we let her stay because of that? I am of the opinion that Canada can no longer afford this form of generosity. However, because of the circumstances involved, there is a potential for adverse publicity. I recommend refusal, but you may wish to clear this with someone at Region, end quote. Baker filed an appeal, but the courts in Ontario upheld the deportation order, and all attempts to intervene in the interest of her children were blocked. She appealed again, and her case was heard by the Supreme Court. In Baker versus Canada 1999, which eventually was heard, Mavis Baker won the right to stay in Canada. And thenceforth, decision makers had to give reasons for their rulings, and courts were required to intervene on the standard of reasonableness. The outrage expressed by the immigration officer that Baker had remained in Canada illegally, working as a domestic worker, since that was likely the only employment she could find, seemed to be heightened by the fact that she dared to become a mother and that she was no longer useful as a worker. Her mental illness rendered her a burden that the country ought to reject. There are several other cases that I have, but I'll pause there. Just to say, I want to move on to what it was that women did in the face of the difficulties of being domestic workers in households in Canada at the time. Because we want always to pay attention to what the women themselves were doing, not only to their circumstances, which were often dire. Domestic workers, many of whom were from the Caribbean, and by the mid-1970s into the 1980s, were working on temporary visas. Whenever they were asked, and there were several small studies scattered across Ontario, especially across Toronto, they reported feelings of deprivation, isolation, and loneliness. They were living, most of them, in their employers' houses. They had to eat the food provided by their employers. They had to work hours that were dictated by their employers because they were outside of labor standards. And very often they had to take wages that were dictated by those employers as well. However, similar to the 7 women and Mavis Baker who resisted their deportation, there is an argument to be made that whilst their circumstances were less than ideal, the women were not passive, but sought a variety of means to advocate for themselves and to improve their situations. Some of them established connections with friends and families and domestic organizations such as Intercede, the church, and their families back home. Others of them sought means of what they called leveling off the relationship within the household by working slowly, breaking vacuum cleaners, refusing to do some tasks so that their employers would have to hire additional help. In fact, many of the women argued that although they saw their time in the households as a kind of purgatory that they were waiting to get through, because most of them had their eyes on prizes of becoming professionals, to using domestic service as a means to get into Canada through that system and on into training and into professional positions. So they saw it, even though sometimes those purgatories lasted for years, and sometimes those purgatories never ended. They used the hope that they would move beyond domestic service as their way of staying upbeat and focused. They established families where they could, and they did everything that they could to make their lives better. After all, they were in the struggle not only for themselves, but for their families and for their children, because most of them were mothers. Thank you.
So, good evening. Thank you for being here, and thank you for having me here to see you and to talk with you and to tell you more about the workers who come from the Philippines and their history as spoken through their own accounts and also to their own evaluations. So the title of my piece is Making PFWP and Caregiver Programs Political. I say that because the countries, we have heard already that countries wealthy enough to have a PFWP-based economy have banded together some time ago to have us all for free or for cheap. So this from the historical perspective of caregivers and temporary workers in Canada. The history is from the point of view gathered for the most recent report of a very international body, which is the International Migrants Alliance, which is an alliance of many migrant workers organizations over the whole world, and with branches. The main locale of that is in Hong Kong and the Philippines, and we have many centers around the world. It's also from documents of Migrant Canada and also from GABRIELA, Ontario, which are all based on the workers' points of view. Some of them have been drawn from participatory action researches, which have been going on since 1992, and also evaluations of work with caregivers and migrant workers. Some of what is here has been put in submissions of GABRIELA, Ontario, to the Senate commanding committees that review the temporary foreign workers program and the family reunification policy. So, and another explanation is that Canada is now the most TFW-based economy in North America, In 2006, US had 160,000 guest workers, but Canada already had 171,844. So that year, Canada admitted more PFWs more than economic migrants because it intensified what it started doing in 2002 by the virtue of the power given to the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration to decide on everything in immigrations and citizenship. He expanded the list of occupations where workers could easily come in, but on temporary restricted visas. The year 2002 was when the new IRPA, or the International Refugee Protection Act, was brought into force, and since then, a series of measures have been adopted to expand the PFWP. This is especially important for Filipinos because in 2007, the Philippines also became the #1 source of migrants and immigrants in Canada, and to date, there are currently around 620,000 Filipino Canadians in Canada, most of them living in urbanized areas. In 2008, when Canada fast-tracked the recruitment of temporary workers in a broad range of trades, they even increased. So Gabriela, I would like to introduce it as a feminist organization which gives advocacy to all Filipino women workers in Ontario. It is connected to the GABRIELA Alliance in the Philippines, which is the largest alliance of women's organizations in the Philippines, and also has a women's political party. Other organizations, but Gabriela has worked on the causes and issues of caregivers with other organizations in Toronto. Or other organizations that worked with them, 1984, which Michele has mentioned already, the Intercede, an advocacy organization with members who were leaders of other organizations of caregivers. And they fought with other organizations against forced remittance, which was applied and demanded of them, of the Filipino caregivers, by the Philippine government, then under the well-known Ferdinand Marcos, who is now dead, but he has been buried in a Heroes Burial, with the Heroes Burial, in the Heroes Memorial Cemetery. And he did that with a so-called stopgap policy, which is going to be temporary, and it was called the labor education, export policy. It's not an education, Barb. So that was a policy without like structural programs, nothing at all. No planning, no bilateral agreements, no laws to protect the workers. So alongside the other organizations, 1992, CFSA, which is a Concerned Filipinos of St. Anna's Church, women's, well, most of them were women in that organization. And 1992, as you may also remember, is when the FDM, or Foreign Domestic Movement, turned into a live-in caregiver program with that very strict requirement that they live in with their employers. Okay, 2009, Juana Tejada law. Juana Tejada was sick. Well, she was diagnosed with cancer when she was applying for permanent residence. They wanted to deport her because of her illness. But she fought that and said there should be no second medical examination of caregivers who have been living here and taking care of children. And, you know, who knows that a disease may have been incurred while working. So she won that, and so there was a Juana Tejada law, which removed the second medical requirement. And then, 2015, the women have been fighting for removal of live-in requirement for so long, even under the FDM, right? Because they know how flexible labor becomes. It becomes such a suffering for the women because they are asked to do anything at all in the house at any time duration at all, according to what the employer wants. So in 2015, finally, it was removed. But then, by that time, people already knew what employer would allow them to go and live out, okay? Because flexible labor is such a wonderful thing, you know. It's very pleasurable for them to like leave the children at home and have a nice night out, or even the whole night, following morning, sleep again. Okay, and now in 2016, the TFWP removal of the 4-year in and 4-year out mandate, in which temporary workers and also caregivers were asked to, complete their permanent residency applications and get them within 4 years. If not, they have to go out and stay in their countries or original countries for 4 years before they can apply again. So that was removed. And Gina Baliwal's case, if people have been following Justicia's campaigns, and one of them was Gina Baliwal, who was a Filipino and was recruited illegally, had no papers after a while. And the recruiter kept getting money from her, more money, so we can do this thing. And so finally she tried to go to Alberta for the provincial nominee program, but still, it couldn't happen. So she came back here and fought it straight out with the government and finally landed in the papers in an editorial, and I think that's what got the attention of the government. Other organizations also fought internationally. And one of them was the Migrant International, which is a very international alliance of all migrante organizations all over the world, which Migrant Ontario is part of. And then in 2008, IMA was also established, and now it's fighting even up to the UN for democratic rights to be given to all temporary foreign workers. If we think of all these points, why do these organizations have to do it for such a long time and nobody listens and nothing much happens? Like 4 year in, 4 year out. But how many people can tell those people already in the Philippines that they can apply now again? There are many difficulties. And so why? So we go to the analysis of international organizations, okay, who have seen it happen all over the world. And they say that concerted international policies promoting migration of workers are there. And they are more and more systematically being arranged so that all migrant workers become temporarily permanent. Okay, their temporariness is permanent in the countries where they go to. So especially after free trade agreements or ASEAN agreements, or these things that happen between North and South countries, as they call it, and they do agreements apparently on the trade part, just the trade part, okay. But I'm sure they also will have to consider the exchange, right? When they're trading with one country, they have to allow allow people to come from there to here. Because in those countries, first, there is joblessness, there is mismanaged economies, and there are economies which just follow the policies of big countries who want to do trade there, especially multinational companies and the big giant companies who extract resources from these countries. So it's a deal inside the big deal, right? So both the countries take advantage of this. And what happens to the caregivers and the migrant workers? We know, right? I mean, all the evidences are there, right? And so governments choose not to listen because they have their agenda already loudly ringing in their ears. So why should they listen? So now we saw in 2002, since 2002, policies have been changing with the new IRPA implementation. And now in 2006, the shift to temporary migrants is very clear because they're making it more difficult for caregivers to get their permanent residency. It makes it more difficult for farm workers and other workers. They have already extended their temporary foreign worker policy that they've been showing farm workers, seasonal farm workers, and caregivers, and those skilled temporary workers, right? They've given them such restrictive regulations, and they have to meet them. Otherwise, they're out, right? So they've extended this to other workers. So can you imagine how many other workers now have to follow the restrictions of the government, right? Okay, you have to give me this much money, you have to, have an income this big, and everything else. Otherwise, you can't have your permanent residency. So it follows the old pattern of the Canadian government from the 16th to the 19th centuries, where European colonial interest was here, right? And they wanted this and that from here in Canada. And post-World War II, the railroad, right? Building the industrialization of this economy. Yeah, they wanted more temporary workers. It continues, right to this day. And then they need to industrialize it. And now when the labor force, the Canadian labor force is shrinking, I think the unions would know that. It is shrinking. And the birth rate is not keeping up with immigrant populations, right? And then labor shortages, say the employers, as in, BC construction sites, Sands of Alberta, and then the major crisis in late 2008, right? We all have that in mind, and this is why they continually want cheaper labor from outside to cover all the work needed here, the dirty, dangerous jobs as well, which no one else will take. And then we also have Canadian experience class, right? They want to hold on to those international students who have had education here, training, and then experience. So why let go of these people? Let them stay here. And then job-specific ties, employer-specific ties to tie the workers to jobs and not change. So this is what they want as a reliable workforce, right? So 2006 also saw C50, and we know that it is always in the interest of the big business and other sectors, healthcare, construction, such as Manitoba's provincial nominee program was for the sector work at Maple Leaf meat processing plant in Brandon, Manitoba, way back in 2000. If people can still remember, that's what happened. And the same thing happened to FDM and the LCP. So the strength in numbers, though, is a very important point for migrant workers. We should look at that because this is the thing that moves our changes forward, society forward. Because if you don't have these numbers and make those numbers active, nothing happens. Right? Even the changes that, hesitatingly or something like that, the government gives, it's because of the action of workers. And also, Canada-wide organizations have their own analysis. And they say that the issues and challenges includes, a very important point for unions. In the face of major economic crisis in Canada, there's a low level of mobilization and working class education among rank and file workers. So, when foreign investors say, hey, we want more major concessions, we're getting poor, the economy is going down, you better give us these workers. And then there has also been a tendency to neglect issues of race, new immigrants, and youth among the traditional union leadership, but I think some are picking up. And I've seen conferences where there are a lot of youth leaders. And job cuts have also affected the world's biggest industrial project, the oil sands in northern Alberta. And then also the federally regulated pensions of workers are also in danger. So the unions also have many problems, and the workers who are in the unions have many problems. But another significant issue for our purposes tonight, facing Canadian workers and unions, is the increasing use of temporary contract workers, what many employers call flexible work, and which is actually precarious work because they tend to lose it all the time. Right? So the number of temporary workers in Canada hit a record 2 million in 2012, according to Statistics Canada. And since the recession, temporary work has grown even more than triple the pace than permanent employment. So up to 14.2% for temporary work between 2009 and 2012, and there's only 3.8% for permanent workers. So even a joint study by McMaster, U, and the United Way in 2013 found 4 in 10 people in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton region, which are in some degree are in precarious work. Okay. Canada has been actively pushing for just-in-time rent-a-worker migrant labor force. In 2007, back to the Philippines became the #1 source. As I've said, it has always been growing. And for 3 decades previously, Canada has been the main destination for tens of thousands of Philippine migrants. Some of them today leave the Philippines at the rate of 6,000 a day. The other thing about the LCP, the people employed here were lured by the promise of the landed immigrant status, as we very well know, is also an attraction for other temporary workers who want the chance at being permanent residents here. So conditions during that time of waiting for applying, for being eligible, has often turned out to be oppressive, exploitative, racist, and heartless. So all the changes began to become more and more, trying to control the workers. But because the Canadian immigration policy is shifting away from recruiting immigrants and permanent residents in favor of recruiting masses of temporary foreign workers, it accentuates the elitist nature, I don't know what else you can call it, elitist nature of immigration policy, and creates a more blatant peer population of workers. One, citizens, workers, and then citizens with rights. And the other of temporary, non-status, generally low-wage workers with limited or no rights. What does that make of the society we are developing? If we have these great tiers pulling us away from each other. And then the Canada-wide organizations say also that Canadian corporations always look for profit in Canada and abroad. So we have Canada participates in so many investment projects around the world. And though it has some social welfare policies such as universal health care and social service, the working people have won for the country through many struggles, right? So Canada is recognized as a middle power for its role in international affairs with a tendency to pursue multilateral solutions. It goes along with the big brother down south. And so working people and their unions are now playing an important role, or must play an important role, in exposing the role of this profit-oriented Canadian explorations abroad. So the last thing is fighting back in more numbers is important. And we have seen this take the stage for many times already. And so that's the important step that we should make forward, or we are already making it. And these new global alliances of grassroots migrants and immigrant organizations, and all these 118 organizations from 25 countries in forming the first international formation of IMA. The delegates noted for a long time others spoke on our behalf, but now we speak for ourselves. So we shall now press on regarding the expected pressures against the TFWP and all the other categories underneath it, and also the extensions of it to other workers as a result of the still unannounced designs, but already rumored about managing labor migration in the new trade deals made in the recent ASEAN summit in Manila. Long live workers. We need a systematic unity against the systemic greed of wealthy and abusive foreign and multinational corporations, bringing ruin to countries which are sources of their cheap labor in their own country or away from it, where they destroy the land, environment, and the people. We can do it. The workers united will never be defeated.
So thanks everyone for coming, and thanks a lot to my fellow presenters. Both were excellent, and I'm really looking forward to our final presenter, Gabriel. What I want to do in my time here are two things, really. First is to give a very quick overview of the history of migrant farm labor in Canada, including a quick discussion of the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program that starts in 1966. And the second thing is I want to make an argument for why we should even be talking about farm labor at the Toronto Workers History Project. What does that have to do with us? So there's been a long history of migrant farm labor in Canada. Some famous examples from a long time ago include the harvest excursions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These featured the movement of hundreds of thousands of workers from Eastern Canada, the Maritimes, Quebec, Ontario, to go out to the prairies and bring in the grain harvests in the prairies. This is an ad from Montreal in 1926, advertising 50,000 jobs for harvesters in the prairies. A more famous ad is this one, advertising 40,000 jobs, and specifically targeted at workers from the US, encouraging them to come across the border to work in the harvest. In this case, they're also being recruited to stay as permanent settlers, but their initial recruitment was as harvest workers. There's lots of other examples of migrant labor in Canada going really far back. I'll just mention one more example, which is the long history of migrant Indigenous hops pickers on the northwest coast in both BC and in the US. So this is a picture of a family of migrant hops workers in Washington state in the late 19th century. And the point of this is just to recognize that there's this longer history of migrant farm labor in Canada. It doesn't start out of nowhere in 1966 with the start of this guest worker program. These things have been around for a long time. And not all these systems of migrant labor, of course, have been purely domestic. As we see in the poster on the right, workers from the US were also recruited as temporary workers. But we have other examples too. In the 1910s, migrant workers came from Belgium to work in Ontario in the sugar beet harvest. From the 1920s to the 1960s, tobacco workers came up from the US South to work in that crop in Ontario. And university students from Europe also came to work in tobacco from the 1960s to 80s. So there's lots of examples of even international temporary farm worker programs and movements before this guest worker program begins. So if all these different systems of migrant labor existed, why then did the SOP, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, why did it start in 1966? I won't get into it too much in the interest of time, but the two main reasons echo some of the things that Michele talked about with the caregivers, the domestic workers. And the two main reasons boil down to employer demand and diplomatic pressure. So even though there are all these different groups of migrant farm workers, employers, farmers were consistently unhappy with their sources of labor. They complained it was hard to find workers and that once they found them, they weren't very reliable. You know, they would quit before the harvest was over and so on. And so they were constantly lobbying the government to do something to give them access to better workers. Of course, from the workers' perspective, we can see that these were some of the lowest paying jobs in any sector. And on top of that, they were dirty and dangerous. And on top of that, they were only temporary jobs that lasted for a few weeks or a few months at a time. So really, it's not surprising at all that farmers had trouble finding workers. But alas, this was a consistent complaint and one that they wanted the government to do something about. Specifically, in the 1950s and 60s, they wanted the government to start a guest worker program with Jamaica. And they were borrowing the example from the US in this case. The US had such a program in existence since the 1940s during the war. So added to employer demand was diplomatic pressure from countries in the Caribbean. These countries had been pressuring Canada, like employers, to start a guest worker program going back to the 1940s at least. And their interests was about alleviating unemployment problems in the Caribbean and also encouraging foreign currency to come back to the home countries. So the Canadian state resisted these requests from employers and Caribbean countries for a long time. And finally in 1966 they caved. And a big reason they caved then has to do with our second reason here, diplomatic pressure. The Canadian government was really concerned about building positive diplomatic relations with newly independent countries in the Caribbean. So they cave in 1966. And they start the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. In its first year, it exists only with Jamaica. And 264 workers from Jamaica come to Canada to work on farms and in food processing plants. This photo here actually depicts one of the first groups of Jamaican workers to work in Canada, circa 1967 in the Niagara region. In later years, other countries would be added to the program. As you can see on the screen here, Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago in 1967, Mexico in 74, and various Eastern Caribbean states in 76. And I won't talk too much about the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program because I know Gabriel's probably going to say some things, and any other questions you have we can get to in the question period. But I'll just say that first it was structured as a temporary seasonal migration program. So workers could come in and work for a few months of the year, but then they were required to go back home. And the last thing I'll say about it is just to note how much it grew over the years. So from 264 workers in 1966, it grows to about 40,000 workers a year these days. And in fact, agricultural workers also come to Canada under other temporary farm worker programs. So the real number of temporary farm workers coming each year is really probably closer to 70 or 80,000. All right, so what does any of this have to do with Toronto or Toronto workers? Well, I'd like to make the argument that it actually has quite a lot to do with Toronto and Toronto workers. But I'll give you three main reasons today. The first is to stress the connections between city and country. So we often think about rural and urban spaces as being totally separate and not having all that much to do with one another. But in fact, the rural and the urban are deeply related and interdependent. To give just two examples to do with Toronto. First, of course, Toronto is a big metropolis with a lot of people who need to eat something. And of course, not that much food is grown in Toronto. So most of this food, of course, comes from outside of the city. Getting in even more specific, when we talk about fruits and vegetables, a very high percentage of the fruits and vegetables eaten in Toronto come from Ontario farms and are sold and distributed at one specific place in the city, and that is the Ontario Food Terminal. So this is a very important connection between city and country that takes place in a very urban place, right on the Queensway, just off the Gardiner, easily seen as you drive by. Taking things from the other perspective, the importance of the city to the country, we might think about the Massey Harris plant on King Street. From the late 19th century well into the 20th century, the Massey Harris plant employed 9,000 people making all sorts of agricultural equipment, tractors, plows, and so on. So this urban production was absolutely critical to rural production, the production of food on farms. And this happened very central in Toronto. The picture on the left displays the plant in its full glory. And on the upper right is what survives of the plant today, which was in fact its office building. And that's the only part that's still around today, and you can find that on King Street at the location on the map there. The second main reason why this matters to Toronto and Toronto workers is that Toronto workers and farm workers are sometimes the same people. So there's been all kinds of historical connections between Toronto workers and farm work. The harvest excursions we talked about before, many people who participated in these excursions were from Toronto. During the Great Depression, unemployed people from the city sought work on farms in the province. After the war, students looking for summer jobs would go to the farm country to get summer jobs. And the examples go on and on. This headline that says, "So, you want a job in tobacco?" is from a radical Toronto publication called GABRIELA, published in 1970. And in this piece, the author explains the ins and outs of working in tobacco for anyone who wanted to take the plunge for the summer. If you think this is only a thing of the past, of urban workers actually seeking jobs in the countryside, you are mistaken. Even today, especially for immigrants and especially for recent migrants without legal status, agriculture remains an important employment option, even in a place as big and bustling as Toronto. One example of this, this is an employment ad published as part of a series of articles by Aylwin Lowe in Rabble. And the ad's in Chinese, as you can see, and it says, "Greenhouse hiring, picking tomatoes." And Aylwin Lowe writes in these articles about basically embedding himself with a group of Chinese immigrants, recent Chinese immigrants. They go to a strip mall at near Jane and Finch, and they get picked up by labor recruiters who take the group of people to Leamington, where they worked in greenhouses for a few weeks. And this is something that happens not just in Toronto, but in cities around Ontario, and probably in other horticultural centers like BC as well. So labor recruiters take people out from cities either for day jobs or for weeks at a time, such as in this case. Okay. So we see even today, farm workers and urban workers, Toronto workers, are sometimes the same people. The last major reason I'll talk about why this matters to us today is that Toronto's labor movement has long supported farm workers' struggles. And just to give you some quick highlights from a timeline, in the 1930s, communist organizers from Toronto, including Jack Scott, played a really important role in organizing tobacco workers. This is something I've looked at in my own research. Fast forward to the 1960s and 70s, Toronto unions were really important in supporting the boycott campaigns of the United Farm Workers of America. This is a photo of Cesar Chavez marching in Toronto with Dennis McDermott, who was at the time with the United Auto Workers and later was president of the CLC. And there were many, many actions in Toronto and committees in support of the United Farm Workers boycott campaigns, which are mostly focused in California. Moving forward to the 1980s, the Canadian Farm Workers Union, which was mostly based in BC, launched an effort to unionize tobacco workers in Ontario. Here again, Toronto was very important. A lot of the activists who participated in this union drive were based in Toronto, including the son of one of our audience members today. And so again, Toronto was central to this organizing tale. Going forward to the present, when we see increasing temporary foreign workers, migrant workers, Toronto again has loomed large in organizing. So the United Food and Commercial Workers and their offshoots, the Agricultural Workers Alliance, and Students Against Migrant Exploitation, they've done a lot of incredible work with farm workers over the years, some of which Craig talked about when talking about Stan Raper. And a lot of these activists, again, have been based in Toronto. Justice for Migrant Workers, which Gabriel and I are both affiliated with, has also been around for over a decade and done actions in Toronto and across Ontario, again featuring a lot of activists from here. This is an action that occurred last year as part of Justicia's Harvesting Freedom campaign at the Ontario Food Terminal, which we talked about before. So the terminal was shut down for a few hours early one Sunday morning. And this again highlighted those connections between city and country. So showing that the exploitation of migrant farm workers in the country is also a story that happens in the city, because this is where a lot of the produce that's being grown and harvested is actually sold and distributed. The top picture there is our final panelist, Gabriel, addressing the rally. All right. So I'll leave it at there. Hopefully I've convinced you that it is in fact relevant for us to be talking about farm labor at the Toronto Workers' History Project. And I'll leave you with a final example of my own days as a farm worker. So further evidence that a Toronto worker is a former farm worker. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the question period.
My name is Gabriel. I'm from St. Lucia. Yesterday was Thanksgiving, right? So I would like everybody to give thanks. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me? Yes. I'd rather using this one. Easy question, Mr. Chairman. What is this?
It's red pepper.
Red pepper. Do we agree? Mr. Chairman, again, it's not a trick question, right? Do you know how many seeds are in there? Do you know how many seeds are in there?
A lot.
Do we agree? Yeah. A lot, but we don't know definitely how many seeds, right? We can see it. And I'm here to tell you that behind this fruit here, there are 20 injustices that migrant farm workers face in Canada. 20 injustices. And that is what my story is about. That the fruits that we eat, the vegetables that we eat, that there are 20 injustices. Yesterday was Thanksgiving. Who did we give thanks to? Why did we give thanks? We don't know. I don't know. But to tell you my story, I want to tell you, just before I'm from St. Lucia, and you know St. Lucia is in the global south, right? As you saw in the map that was previously shown. And there's a big divide between the north, the developed, and the south. Global inequality, that inequality, it's not an accident, it's by design. And I would like to encourage each and every one of you to watch LIFE, L-I-F-E, and DEBT, D-E-B-T. These are the structures that Canada is part of that creates that divide. Talking about that divide, I want to tell you, before I came to Canada, my father was arrested and taken to court. He was taken to court for stealing a cow. Now, in my home country, what is a cow? A cow is not just an animal. A cow is an emergency fund. To have an animal just feeding on grass, and after a couple of months, you can make money out of that. That's an emergency fund for people in my home country. For somebody to steal your emergency fund, how would you feel? How would you feel, Mr. Chairman? Sorry? Angry. Angry. Show me that you're angry, Mr. Chairman. Well, that's exactly what happened. So the person decided to take my father to court. But my father, when he got to court, during the matter, he said he didn't have a lawyer. Something important like that, he didn't have a lawyer. You know what he said? He said one day he was walking home. He saw a really, really nice rope. I think I have a nice rope, Mr. Chairman. He saw a really, really nice rope. That's what he said. He decided to drag that rope home, and when he got home, what did he get? A cow. Is that looking like a cow? Is that looking like a cow, Mr. Chairman? That's the closest I could get, right? That's all he said. He found a nice rope, he dragged the rope home, and when he got home, he decided to check the other end. And at the other end, he found a cow. In a similar way, I was in my home country, and I was forced to pick up a rope. I was forced to pick up a rope. I was forced to pick up a rope. And I'll tell you why I was forced. But what did I get at the other end of the rope? I didn't get a cow. I got a telephone number. And what's my telephone number? I want you to dial my number with me tonight. What's my telephone number? 51. I got a number, 51. What's my number? 20. Next number, 20. Are you all dialing that number? 3. That's my number. And that's my story. That's what I found. Now, I was forced to pick up that rope. I was forced. Why was I forced, or how was I forced? Because of global inequality, which is just what I told you. Because of global inequality. And as I said, if you watch Life and Debt, that is on YouTube, roughly an hour, you'd have an idea what I'm referring to. Another reason why I was forced to pick up that rope is because of WTO. My country, the main crop in my country was bananas. America said, no, you cannot have preferential treatment in Europe. No, that's not fair trading. So America challenged that through WTO. Who are the people behind WTO? That is the question. Global inequality again. Because of the WTO, a lot of people were literally driven off the land, and unemployment as a result went up. Another reason why I'm in Canada is because of environmental destruction. Who are the ones causing global warming and climate change? Who are the ones? And who are the ones paying the price? As a result of a hurricane, I'm in Canada. We are the ones in the global south that are paying the price. In 2009, I was self-employed doing 5 different things. I felt so confident that my income was diversified. Even though one was affected, I would still live a decent life. But just one hurricane just messed up everything. And to be honest, that was the lowest point in my life. To be unemployed and with a family to support, that was the lowest point. And it was then I got that opportunity to work in Canada as a migrant farm worker. Ed did a great job. I don't even know what more to tell than to share a little part of my story, right? 31 years ago, this year, 31 years ago, I was on the verge of leaving school without completing a full secondary school education. And thanks to Canada, 45 years ago, they gifted us with a secondary school, and I was able to get a spot at that school. So Canada have been good to me in my home country 31 years ago. Canada have been good to me when I became unemployed. Wouldn't you feel wonderful and great to come to that country that have been so good to you in your home country? That was the feeling. Being unemployed, getting an opportunity to earn a living in that country that have been so good to you in your home country. But the sad truth is, my expectations and reality on the ground, there are 20 injustices. And this is what I call the 20 dark sides of Canada. And that's what I want to tell you. And the simplest way I can think of telling you is the simplest way I can make my story is to show you in the form of a plant. Now, this plant here, it's a 51-year-old tree. And what does that plant represent? What does that tree represent? The Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, which my colleague just told you about. 51 years. Can I carry a 51-year-old tree? But this number is important to me. When I turn that number back to front, 51, it's 15 years. I am here today, right here today, because of people like Ed and the people in my group. For 15 years, they've been a voice for the voiceless in Canada. For 15 years. If I put a 0 behind that 15, what is that number, Ed? Well, let me go to the chairman. The chairman is... I need to keep him on his toes, sorry? Isn't that an important number in Canada today? 150. Who are the people celebrating? Is it the victor or the victim? What is that 150 about? Who are the people celebrating? And can everybody in Canada, can everybody in society rightly and justly celebrate? That is the issue there. Who are the people? Whose story are you listening to? Is it the victor or the victim? Whose story are you listening to? And that is what this number is important to me. So that is that tree, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. The 20, I want you to picture that tree here. It's bearing flowers, right, Mr. Chairman? Are these really good flowers? But I want you to picture that tree with 20 fruits. But I want to tell you that the number 3 I have there is about the tree itself. This 3 here stands for the 3 parts of the tree. I want to tell you about that tree. Tell you, Mr. Chairman, I'm very poor at managing time, right? So please tell me when I'm going over, right? Okay. So this 3 here stands for the 3 parts of the tree, the stem, the branches. Do I have branches? And the leaves, right? I am in Canada because of the stem. Why am I in Canada? To do jobs Canadians do not want to do. Ed told you all the D words. What are the D words? The dirty jobs, the difficult jobs, the dangerous jobs. That is why I'm in Canada. To do jobs Canadians do not want to do. What are the branches? The federal government said, oh, I'm going to bring those guys to do those dirty jobs. The branches, but with no rights to apply for status. We cannot apply for status, so basically, we do not have the same rights that a Canadian worker have. And the little rights that we have, we don't even know about them, because the way the system is designed, you don't even know about your rights. So we are here to do dirty jobs with no rights. What does the LIV stand for? We are here to do dirty jobs with no rights, but the government says, I'm going to tie those guys by way of a tied work permit. We are tied to an employer. You're tied to an employer with no rights to do dirty jobs. Is that a good tree, Mr. Chairman? No answer from my chairman. But you allowed it in here anyway, Mr. Chairman. So that's the tree. So is that a good tree? Can you expect good fruits from that tree? So how many fruits does that tree have, Mr. Chairman? 20 fruits, right? I don't know if I have enough time, but let me see if I can run through my 20 fruits. For so long I've been working with Eddie, he never taught me how to do a PowerPoint, and look at my PowerPoint. You love it? Mr. Chairman, you heard that, Mr. Chairman? Okay, these are the 20 things I call the 20 dark sides of Canada, right? 1, to be tied to your employer. You know that, right? You're tied to your employer. Who would not be happy to be tied to something you love? There's nothing wrong with being tied to your employer. to me. But listen to that. You're tied to an employer, but with no rights. You do not have the same rights as a Canadian worker. The farmer controls your housing. You're tied to him. Look at the word, he controls your housing. What does that tell you? And what about our housing? Ed, what can you say about our housing? It's overcrowded. It's below standard. It's not regulated. And the list can go on and on. I'm praying for the day that when one employer would say, I want my children to spend the night or a month in a bunk house. I'm praying for that day. I have a contract, which is a piece of paper. It's not enforceable. Why isn't it a contract that's tying you to your employer in Canada? But my work permit ties me to the employer. And I have a contract, it's not enforceable. That tells you how much, it's just a piece of paper that is. And look at that, number 5. The moment I speak up, Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to speak up, Mr. Chairman. The moment I speak up, my employer sends me back home. The threat of deportation keeps me quiet. The threat of deportation keeps, that's why you do not hear about these stories. That's why Ed had to tell there's a connection between the city and the farms, the urban, the rural areas. Because the threat of deportation keeps us quiet. I have a cow, but Mr. Chairman had somebody to do a leather show, right? I want you to put yourself, I want you to take off your shoes, and I want you to put yourself in the shoe of a migrant farm worker. Would you be happy for you or your children to be working in these conditions? And this is just 5. I don't know how much time I have, right? So I want you to put yourself in the migrants. Number 6, that goes without saying, right? We face harassment and racism. That's a given in Canada. Mr. Trump speaks about it, but in Canada, quietly. Quietly. Number 7, what's number 7? Can you believe that in Canada, we are denied, so many farm workers are denied minimum, even the living caregivers, right? Because who dictates the pay? They are outside of the standards. Who does that, right? We are denied even minimum wage. Not even a living wage. Not even a living wage we're talking about. What is it? Minimum. You know what's minimum? Minimum is at the rock bottom, you know. Minimum. Barely getting by. We do those dangerous jobs. But when we get injured, we come here as well-oiled machines. The moment you get injured, instead of allowing you to get treatment in Canada, what they do, it's so easy to send you back home, and it's so easy to get another person to replace you. Medical repatriation. Canada, sweet Canada. For this year in Ontario, 5 migrant workers have died. For this year. They're just this year. But when you go to any workplace in Canada, I call it the Bible, the Occupational Health and Safety book. I call it the Bible. It's so thick. I call it the Bible. All those guidelines in there, policies or whatever that are in there, they are the result of inquests into work-related accidents and deaths. Not one inquest in the whole of Canada, not one. From what year? He told from 1966. Canada. What does that tell you? Not one inquest into the death of any migrant farm worker. How am I doing with time, Mr. Chairman? I don't have money to pay you for time, Mr. Chairman. How am I doing? Keep going, okay? Where am I, number 11? You see, our problem is the labor laws, you're outside of the standards, right? The labor laws excludes us. We are under the table. I'm so happy you didn't cover that table, Mr. Chairman. That's transparency, right? But in Canada, the table is covered. So under the table, you cannot see that. We are excluded. So the labor laws, they exclude us. And the little rights that are in there, they're not being enforced. They're not being enforced because our employer knows the system, the person in charge of just one phone call and everything is taken care of, right? They're not being enforced. But I'm telling you, out of the 20 I'm going to tell you, number 14, nothing compares to number 14. To be physically separated from your family, nothing can be compared to that. To be physically separated from your family. What is the point in life? Is it for me to send presents to my children to replace my presents? Or is it to spend the best thing in life with the people that matter to you the most. I have 2 children. They're both teenagers. My son started college, and in 2 months, he quit school. What does that tell you? Is that helping me to contribute well to society, or isn't that part of a trap, a vicious cycle? When somebody quits school, what is that, where is that heading to? Because we are physically separated. From the time I started coming to Canada, my daughter's performance have been going down. Is that helping me? Every day I fight 2 wars in Canada. And what are those 2 wars? I fight for better conditions, and I worry about my family back home. 2 wars. Every day you fight 2 wars in Canada. And that's the reality in Canada. Your best days in Canada. Yesterday was what, sir? Mr. Chairman? Thanksgiving. The day you give thanks is the day I cry the most. Your Mother's Day, Father's Day, Christmas Day, Family Day. These are the days we cry the most. Family separation. Global inequality, and I'm telling you, the balance, the empower imbalance in Canada, that is at the root of it. Number 15, what is at the root of those things? The Canadian immigration policy. They have one policy that have me with no status, and another policy that have other people with status and with rights. The policy. So my poverty in Canada, P is for poverty, is because of the policies of the politicians. All the P's I give you, Mr. Chairman, not your policy. You see how easy I made it for you, Mr. Chairman? So, is the political, our problem here is politics, policies of the politicians. How am I doing this time, Mr. Chairman? And the last part I'll run for quickly, I guess. Can you believe that? We are here to do jobs Canadians don't want to do, and we have to pay to work in Ontario. We have to pay to do that. And the live-in caregivers, those recruiters, you'll know about the stories of how exorbitant. Like you come here and you have one set of debt that it will take you years and years to service. How do you get out of those things, right? Number 17. It is illegal for farm workers to unionize in Canada. If it is illegal, does that make it right? And even though things are legal, does that make it right? Who dictates legal and illegal? Who? The politician. Whose interests are they serving? The workers or the donors? Whose interests are they serving? Number 18. Power imbalance. There's so much power in the hands of my employer. He can just send me home. What is there to defend me? Is there any recourse for me? Number 19, look at that again. Canada can go to China. I have to come on stage for me to show my chairman. Canada can go to China and tell China, you need to improve your human rights. Canada can go to the UN and tell the UN, the same rights and privileges that my citizens enjoy, I'll extend them to refugees. Canada. But does Canada tell you that in 2017, there are over 70 indigenous communities with the most basic. Right, what is that? Is it hydro or is it water? The land of many waters. What does that tell you? Number 20, look at the injustices. Number 20, last year, the federal government claimed that they're doing a review of the temporary foreign workers program. A review. The word review gave me confidence that they'll do a good job. And that's the intention. That's a political word. Review. But look at the manner in which it was done. They never invited us. It wasn't televised. Transparency, right? And look at that. We are demanding one thing. Our demand is one thing, right? And what is our demand? Mr. Chairman, I want you to call it out. They would hear you better. Status now. That is our demand. Status is rights. Rights, if we have rights, it would help us to take care of most of these challenges. Not all, most of them. Status. But you know what the federal government came up with? They came up with 21 recommendations. 21. Tell me, is there a place in Toronto where you can buy a pot, and if you put one egg in that pot, you'll get 21 eggs? I want to know, is there a place? And that's your government. We asking for one thing, they give us 21. But what is that 21? The 21, it goes all around the bush, and it does not hit the nail on the head. That's your government. That's our government. So, in closing, Mr. Chairman, I need to talk about the root. We need to go to the root of the problem, right, Mr. Chairman? So we can see, did we agree that this is a bad tree? And did we agree that I have to give Mr. Chairman 20 fruits, right, to clean up, right? So we need to get to the root of that. There are 5 things at the root of that. 5 things. What is at the root of that, right? At the root of that tree is, we have a Canadian society. Mr. Chairman, do you rather a kiss or a slap, Mr. Chairman? That's a simple, it's not a trick question, simple question. A kiss or a slap? A kiss. Beautiful. Mr. Chairman, if I tell you that the kiss is a lie and the slap is the truth, which one do you want, Mr. Chairman? Do not answer. But we all know a lie gives instant relief, right? We hear what we want to hear, we feel relief, but we know there are consequences to the lie. But you know the truth? They say the truth is like surgery. When you have surgery, it will hurt, right? But with time, it will heal. What I'm about to tell you, I'm not too sure whether it's a kiss or whether it's a lie. Whether it's a kiss or whether it's a slap. Whether it's the truth or whether it's a lie. At the end of this, I want you to tell me, individually, tell me whether I kissed you or whether I slapped you, right? Let us get to the root of it, right? In Canadian society, we know about the story of residential schools, right? Mr. Chairman, how many years did that exist in Canada? You forgot, Mr. Chairman. That's your homework, number 1, Mr. Chairman. Over 100 years. How many years? This year, Canada is celebrating 150, right? Let us, out of 150, we're taking away 100 for residential schools, because that is serious injustice, right? The 60 scoop, for how many years did is it 60 years, Mr. Chairman? For how many years did that exist? I'm not too sure. But listen to that. Only last week they said that the government is taking settlement, right? Did they? Was that 60 scoop? Was that fair treatment? What about THC? What is that? I didn't even know about it. Last week I got to know about that in Canada. That existed in Canada. What is that? The home children. Over 100,000 children were taken from orphanages in England to work on farms in Canada. They said that the abuses were endless. Orphanages, no parents, nobody to take care, to look after them. So, you know what, abuses in Canada. I didn't even know about this thing. How many years? Oh, maybe 100, from 18-something to, Canada. What is the other one? The Chinese railway workers. The Chinese railway workers. We all know how they were used in Canada. They were abused in Canada. And at the end, what happened? They were refused in Canada. And the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, how old is that program? 51 years. So if we take away 100 for just residential school, and we take away 51 for this program, what figure are we left with, Mr. Chairman? Right? We're in the negative, right? And that's the truth about a lot of negative things are present in our society. And that is the point here. That I'm telling you that the fruits that you eat, the vegetables that you eat, there are a lot of negatives. There are 20 negatives behind that. 20 negatives. So the question is, when you buy your fruits and your vegetables, are you buying it from people who respect or who exploit? Who respect the soil or exploit the soil? Who respect the workers or exploit the workers? Who respect the environment or exploit the environment? That's the question. At the root of our problem, at the root of that tree, at the root of society, are the politicians who are putting those negative stuff into motion. That's at the root of the problem. At the root of the problem are the laws and the policies of those politicians. One policy have me with no rights. Another policy have the employee with so much rights, so much power. But ultimately, at the root of our problem might be you, Ed. At the root of our problem. At the root of our problem might be the chairman too, let me see. At the root of our problem might be you, Mr. Chairman. It might be you, Kara. At the root of our problem might be you, might be me. But every time I point my finger, freeze coming back. It might be me too. At the root of the problem might be us. We choose to ignore these problems, or we choose to sit by and do nothing about it. The question is, when I look at my hand as a migrant farm worker, there's no power in there. I don't have a vote, so there's no power in there. But when I look at your hands, Mr. Chairman, I can have a good look. That's a hard working, but I see lots of votes in there. There's power. I'm interested in that, Mr. Chairman. That's the difference. The politicians are interested in your vote. And that is where you come in, I come in. That you can apply pressure. At the root of the problem are political stuff, right? At the root of the problem is politicians and the policies. At the root of the solution, the root to our solution is to change those laws and those policies. How do we do that? I can figure out 101 ways to do that. But ultimately, not until we change the laws, those unjust laws, unjust policies, not until we change them would we really say that we've done something. How do we change them? Organize is one. But to be organized, to hit the nail on the head, you need to call up your MP. Who is your MP, Mr. Chairman? Tell me now. That cannot be a homework. Freeland? Freeland? That's stolen. How can it be Freeland, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, very good. Your homework is to call her, to tell her, come here right now, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, our homework is to call our politicians, right? Call our politicians. You know what they say? Oh, in Ottawa, they, in our, how it's called? The area that they represent, what is it called? Riding. Yeah, people don't tell us anything about that. That's not an issue. That's what they say. But if you call, Mr. Chairman, would you encourage your family to call? By calling, that is one way of putting this on the agenda. I'm telling you, our issue as migrant farm workers is not isolated in a corner. Our issues are related to your issues. Why? The federal government in power right now, they won on the ticket of real change. Real change. Where's the real change? You know what song they're singing now? New reality. And what's the new reality? Short-term employment. Is that what you want? Where did they take that from? They took that from us. We are here temporarily, short-term. And now they're bringing it to mainstream employment. So whatever happens, we are guinea pigs, right? Whatever they do with us, they're bringing it to mainstream. So it's important that we stand together and work together, right? So in the interest of time, I would like to thank each and every one. In closing, I want to say two little things. I have a petition that I would encourage you to sign. And there's a space in it. In addition to your telephone number, I'd rather your email address. That's one. I also have a flyer in there that I'm hoping that you'll take one. But ultimately, I hope that I've touched you. Telling you my story is not an easy thing for me. But I feel confident that the opportunity that you've given me, I've made use of it, knowing that my story, my telephone number, it's not a unique number. It's the same number that temporary foreign workers in Canada face. That's the same number. If you dial that number, 100, thousands of telephones will ring. This is what we go through every day. That's why I feel confident that the time I have given, that I speak not only for myself, share my story, but the stories of all the hands that go to put food on your table for 51 years. Thank you.